My name's Joan Konopka. I'm a member of the Unitarian Church in Chatham, and I'm so pleased to be reading you Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. This is a very old book because it was written in the 1840s. So you have to bear with some of the language. It's different than we're used to using. Where we left off last was that Scrooge had met the ghost of Christmas past, and the ghost was taking him back to his childhood days where he was a student at a school. So they walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance with its bridge, church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies were seen trotting toward them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in the country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. These are but the shadows of things that have been, said the ghost. They have no consequences or no consciousness of us. The jocund travelers, or the joyful merry travelers, came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmases as they parted at crossroads and byways for their separate homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Our Merry Christmas, what good had it ever done to him? The school is not quite deserted, said the ghost. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the highroad by a well-remembered lane and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked, little chickens, and strutted in the stables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold and vast. There was an early savor in the air, a chilly bareness in this place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain, dead forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the painting, not a drip from the half-thawed winter spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one of the despondent poplar trees, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence, and gave a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self. Intent upon his reading, suddenly a man in foreign garments, wonderfully red and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe stuck in his belt and leading by the bridle on a donkey laden with wood. Why, it's Ali Baba, Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. It's dear, old, honest Ali Baba. Yes, yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come for the first time, just like that. Poor boy. And Valentine, said Scrooge, and his wild brother Orson. There they go. And what's his name? Who was put down in his drawers asleep at the gate of Damascus? Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom, turned upside down by the genie. There he is upon his head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess? To hear Scrooge expending all that earnestness on his nature, on such subjects, in a most extraordinary voice, between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city. Instead, there's the parrot, said Scrooge. Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growing out the top of his head. There he is. Poor Robinson Crusoe, he called him, when he came home again after sailing around the island. Poor Robinson Crusoe. Where have you been, Robinson Crusoe? The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for his life to the little creek. Hello! Hoop! Hello! Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said, in pity for his former self, poor boy, and he cried again. I wish, Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff. But it's too late now. What is the matter? Asked the spirit. Nothing, said Scrooge, nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something. That's all. The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved his hand, saying it as it did so. Let us see another Christmas. Scrooge's former self grew large, and at the words and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything that had happened so, that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for their jolly holiday. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously toward the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms about his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. I have come to bring you home, dear brother, said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. I'll bring you home, home, home. Yes, said the child, brimful of glee, home for good and all, home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That's home like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, and are never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world. You are quite a woman, little Fan, he exclaimed. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness toward the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, bring down Master Scrooge's box. There. and in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlor that ever was seen, with the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of these dainties to the young people at the table, at the same time sending out a meager servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but it was the same pep as he had tasted before. He had rather not Master Scrooge's trunk being by the time tied on the top of the chaise, and the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gently and gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoar-frost and snow from off the dark leaves of all the evergreen-like spray. Always a delicate creature without a breath might have withered, said the ghost, but she had a large heart. So she had, said Scrooge. You're right. I'm not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, as I think, children. One child, said Scrooge. True, said the ghost. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, yes. Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now on the busy thoroughfare of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressings of the shops that they were too. It was Christmas time again, but it was evening, and the streets were lightened up. Both stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew where they were. No, said Scrooge. Why, I was apprentice here. They were in, at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again. Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, and laughed all over himself, from his shows to his organ of benevolence, and called out in comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! Dick! Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his apprentice. Dick Williams, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear Dick. Yo-ho, my boys, said Fezziwigs. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve. Dick, Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the butters up, cried old Fezziwigs with a sharp clap of his hands. Open the shutters, is what he said, before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, and then up in their place, 4, 5, 6, barred them and pinned them, 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. That was how they closed up shop in those days. They put shutters in the window. Hey-ho! Cried old Fezziwigs, skipping down from the high desk with a wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads, and let's have a lot of room. Hilly-ho, Dick! Cheer up, Ebenezer! Clear away. There was nothing they would have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away. with old Fezziwigs looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable piece was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life. Forevermore, the floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright as a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it and turned the 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from the next door, but one, who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. And they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some graciously, some awkwardly, and some pushing, some pulling. In they all came anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands round and back again, the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round, in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again as soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwigs, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, though there were no dances yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home, exhausted, on a shutter, and he were a brand new man, resolved to beat him out of sight. And there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled. These are all meats. And there were mince pies, and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it to him, struck up Sir Roger de Courvelay. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, the top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwigs would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig's sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's cuffs. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would have become of them next. And when old Fezziwigs and Mrs. Fezziwigs had gone all through the dance, advanced and retired, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again. Fezziwigs cut so deftly that he appeared to be without his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger.